Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Stelios Panagiotou. He is a Grecian immigrant to the United Kingdom and a host over at the lotuseaters.com website. And by site, I mean they've got a lot of stuff there. It's like viewing a vista of content. He is a philosopher and economics major, and in this conversation we talk a lot about politics from a philosophical point of view. A little bit of anthropology in there too. Kind of weighty topics. He's a great guy. His brain is just on fire. He really loves engaging with ideas like the Greek he is. You can find him via the links below, as well as links to support this channel. Without further ado, here is Stelios Panagiotou. How do I pronounce your last name? I want to hear it from the horse's mouth, so to speak.
Okay, it's Panagiotou. Okay, so think of a yacht, a luxury yacht. Panagiotou.
What does it mean?
Well, Panagiotis is literally in Greek means all holiness or pan-holiness. Greek names are very Orthodox Christian in their sophistication. So for instance, we have Anastasios, which is resurrection. We have several, biblical references to lots of names post-Christianity arising. So Panagiotis comes from basically this, it's pan-holiness. Now, I'm not holier than thou, but that's what it means.
Yeah. Are you practicing Orthodox? I keep on running into Orthodox Christians nowadays. So
I am a bit weird in that respect because I have a faith struggle. I'm not a materialist. Materialist makes zero sense to me, and also from a philosophical perspective. I do believe in, something higher, as we say, and something transcendent. It's just that I want to conceptualize it better before I speak about it. Now, I'm very friendly towards Neoplatonism, but also have zero problem with being called a Christian and an Orthodox, because I had a Christian wedding. I'm very sympathetic to the tradition. It's just that I think that before I speak about it, I really want to do the internal journey, so to speak. It's an issue. It's a long struggle. So I don't know if this is a very bemusing answer.
Oh, that's fun. How does, so politics comes before religion for you? Is that fair?
I think it's separate.
Okay.
I know that this is one big issue you are discussing with several of your guests, but I think that in some respects they're separate.
So just so we can get like a perspective on your perspective, when did you immigrate to Britain, and what kind of culture differences are you bringing to bear on the perspective of the West? Because Greek is the very crux of the West.
Yes. I came to England in 2013. And I'm in England ever since, with a small, brief period where I went back for my military draft. It's obligatory in Greece. Some people who migrate abroad don't go back for it. I went back for it, and then I came back to the UK. As far as culture is concerned, I'd say that this is a very great conversation because we can divide the East and the West across several lines, some of which put Greece into the West, others put it into the East. For instance, if we're talking about cultural issues that have to do with ancient Greece and what we now call Western culture, there's a huge overlap and a really strong degree of continuity. And if we talk about Christianity, then yes, we do have the West-East split of Christianity, but I don't think that it's as momentous a divide as Christianity and Islam, so to speak. It's still different denominations of Christianity. And well, it really depends. I had zero trouble integrating here or coexisting with people here, because I'm one of those Greeks who can easily fit in an Anglosphere context. Because I didn't even have an issue with it. It's not that there is so much. Okay, yeah, I can sometimes try and speak a bit less loud, but that's it. It's there isn't something I'd say that there is an issue. I'm not gonna, I'm not gonna go and say everyone here doesn't deserve rights, or everyone should respect all of my whims, like some other people are doing here.
Yeah. But how do you think, if you're aware of it, this is kind of a difficult question, how do you think your Greek culture, background, early life influences how you see what's happening in Britain and in America, insofar as those are the cultural conversations that, whether you like it or not, if you're an internet commentator, you get swept up in?
Yes. Greece has suffered from the left hegemony ever since the 60s. And it's it's a really strong left hegemony. The stuff we see in universities in Greece, and we have seen, for instance, are just manic. We literally had leftist mobs building bricks and cementing professors within their studies. First time I went to my school, to my university, I went to the Athens University of Economics and Business. My background is also in economics. There was a communist and an anarchist mob fighting each other, and I opened the door, and literally someone came out and was in blood. He was bleeding, and he sneezed, and I was covered with blood.
Huh.
So I think I have a good sense of proportion as far as the elements of how far the left has hijacked institutions and how much actual moral corruption has entered the scene. And I do see several things here in England and also in the US by people who I talk to that communicate a healthy perspective, if you'd like me to put it this way. Like, you guys want to survive. And I respect this.
Mm-hmm.
And
what was the influence of communism on Greece, just for a little bit more cultural or historical context?
Yes. So communists have infiltrated basically all countries. They have tried to, throughout the globe. We had a civil war post World War II, which in many respects is considered to be the first act of the Cold War. It's before the war in Korea. And we had leftists and communists who waged warfare against the other forces, despite the fact that Stalin had told them that he won't help them. And we had 3 years of bloodshed from 1946 to 1949 that led to hundreds of thousands of deaths, and ended in 1949 with the Communist Party being outlawed. And then it was, I think they rescinded that ban in the 70s, and we do have a Communist Party. I think it's the only openly Stalinist party in England, in Europe, and it has 5 to 6%. But that's it. It doesn't seem to be going more than that. Mm-hmm. But
openly Stalinist, so they want camps and stuff? What kind of Stalin are we talking about?
It's not so much that they'll say that they want camps, but they will say that Stalin wasn't as bad as he has been portrayed to be. And all of that was essentially Western propaganda, but also Khrushchev's propaganda after Stalin. Everyone in Western Europe, I think, has a very good sense, in Eastern Europe, has a very good sense of communism. And if you see lots of people from Eastern Europe, they're really anti-communist like myself. They have a really strong streak in that.
Mm-hmm.
So me coming here is a sign of respect for the culture, but also a sort of, yeah, I mean, I want to see what's working. I want to help people maintain what's working, and also try to, you know, influence my countries in the future to step to the right direction.
Mm-hmm. So the Lotus Eaters has I mean, Mr. Benjamin and some of the other guests have a decidedly post-liberal or even kind of anti-liberal bias or push that's kind of come to the fore lately. What's your perspective? Like, do you think that liberalism is the mark we should be aiming, or is, you know, something that we should maintain or deconstruct or get over? And then what are the options do you see from your perspective of what's left if we go past liberalism?
So I do think that this is to a degree the case. A lot of my colleagues and friends, they do have this tendency to go against what is traditionally called liberalism. I think that properly understood, it's a good tradition and it has lots of answers for us to give. And it's a very interesting discussion to have with respect to, you know, what's good about it, what's its deficiency, and when we talk about its deficiency, what's the remedy? And people do say this, that, you know, there is anti-liberals, post-liberals, classical liberals, but I think the most important thing is to see how we act as individuals as opposed to ideologically speaking. And in that respect, I think we have great free speech here. We have lots of discourse, lots of debates, and I'm really grateful for being here, and I really appreciate what Carl is doing here. So I think that, in a sense, yes, he does express sometimes some views I disagree with. I express some views he disagrees with. But the very fact that we can have this discussion, and in a way that it isn't had anywhere else, or almost anywhere else, says to me everything I want to know, basically. Because I don't know if you have followed me for a while on X. I follow you, but I'm not of the censorious type. I'm not one of those people who wants to come and say, well, if you disagree with me, you should burn in hell, or no one should listen to you. I'm very far from that.
Yeah. I don't know if it's necessarily an aspect of liberalism proper, but the liberal mode of discourse, like, and by that I mean openness, the willingness to hear out arguments, to let the so-called marketplace of ideas at least theoretically take place. I think that's a core liberal value or principle. So when somebody's anti-liberalism, they're not necessarily anti that. They're usually talking about some other assumptions, basically blank slatism, how we articulate what we mean by equality, and how even the idea of equality under the law always kind of slips into this kind of blank slatist, we should all be equal one way or another. We have to equalize. It's not enough to try to set up a neutral institution. And the people in the post-liberal camp are trying to say, from what I hear, there's no such thing as a neutral institution. So it has to have some sort of positive moral framework upon which it can be liberal after the fact. So when people are kind of in the post-liberal, and I don't think the term woke right I think it's kind of run its course. It was kind of fun for a while, but whatever is woke right has been kind of untied by the people who use it. But people in that camp, people in the post-liberal camp, whether they're Christian nationalists or or worse, quote unquote, I think that they still rely on free speech and argument at this stage in order to get their ideas out there and to test their ideas. So I don't think that that's necessarily on the chopping block, though maybe other people think otherwise. And that's why classical 90s liberals are worried about this threat on the right.
Right. So there is a very substantial degree of what you said that I agree with. And the other stuff is not necessarily that I disagree with. It's, I think I could frame them in a different way and perhaps lead the discussion to a sort of different avenue. So you laid 5-6 elements into the discussion there. That was a very pithy statement, and thank you for this. And let me say from my perspective how I see things. So number one, let me start from the end. The very fact that some people may occasionally use some ideas and appeal to some ideas doesn't mean that they believe in them. They could appeal to them or use them for political expedience, and then in a Buddhist sense, throw the ladder away once they have climbed it. It's like using the system in order to terminate the system. Right, so I think that suffices for now, at least for this point. Now, as far as what you said before about neutrality and neutral institutions, I don't know if it may surprise you, but I agree with you. Because, yes, I don't think that there can be any such thing as a morally neutral institution. I think that this is essentially impossible. And if it's not impossible, it's something that will generate problems along the way. It's bound to. Because people, however, we have some realists who constantly say, well, I'm doing value-free analysis. It's not that I exactly believe this, but there are some people who say this. I do think that most people tend to view things also in terms of what they believe is justified. And there would be no propaganda if that weren't the case. So even people who are saying that people are stupid, people don't have any kind of power or something, how do you explain propaganda? And propaganda tries to justify the moves and the tactics the propagandist wants to use. So I completely agree with you. There's no such thing, or even there is, there shouldn't be such thing as a morally neutral institution. That said, I think that when we properly understand the tradition of classical liberalism, we see that neutrality isn't an abstract thing. It's a very specific thing. And the way I tend to understand it is, and I think it's very explicit, both in the writings of some classical but also modern liberals, whose variety I'm not particularly fond of. But also if we bear in mind the history of how liberal institutions and ideas arose and became prominent, which is very far from ideological. It's not people who came up with some principles along the way, they communicated them, and suddenly everyone said, oh, that's a nice idea, let's impose it. I don't think that's the case. So neutrality in this context is, more often than not, neutrality of the state towards totalizing moralistic doctrines. In other words, the state does have laws, it's not lawless, and these laws, presumably in classical liberalism, which has a huge natural law tradition of morality strain into it, you do want laws to appeal to morality. But the issue is that there is a huge problem with trying to enforce a moral doctrine on people that enforces a conception of the good life, not because theoretically there is something particularly repugnant about it upon hearing it, but because from 1517 to at least 1648 and a bit later, we had this clash of groups that tried to do this. Protestants and Catholics and various strands of Protestantism, and each of them tried to enforce a totalistic conception of the good life. And we had lots of pragmatists lots of pragmatists and lots of realists who try to create a balance of power, like Catherine of Medici in the French Wars of Religion, who tried to establish a balance of power, but it wasn't good enough for any side. Why? Because they went for 100% of their view of how salvation is to be achieved. So at some point that arose by a number of stalemates, which also involves the element of the balance of power. If there wasn't that element, the Protestant Reformation would have the fate of the Lollards, for instance. And eventually we had a Europe and then a US in the 18th century mostly, that tried to say, right, we need to solve this. If we have sides that try to enforce that totalistic doctrine upon other people, we're going to have this bloodshed. We have 131 years of this bloodshed. Let's stop it. So neutrality, if we check the history of the tradition, that's where neutrality comes about for the most part. Now, are there people who are ideologues and they try to write papers and they try to stand out in academia and they try to be very idealistic and sell books to a very idealistic and lazy audience? Yes. And to the degree that they speak for the tradition, they are harming the name. So if you're protesting against that kind of naive tradition, or that kind of tradition as it is portrayed by these people, I'm 100% with you. All I'm saying is perhaps a lot of people are a bit quick in throwing out the baby with the bathwater, and a sort of historical, actual reading of the tradition will dissolve lots of doubts. In the same way that lots of right-wingers right now say, well, please, James Lindsay, stop saying that everyone who reads communist literature or neo-Marxist critical theory is a commie. And let's read it for what it is, and let's see what Gramsci says, let's see what Althusser says, let's see what Foucault says. Yeah, let's do this, but let's also do this for classical liberalism.
What is your take on... So, in the historical context that we're speaking about, there was these wars of religion, these wars of belief, and they did have a totalizing nature to them. And so there was an armistice, and that armistice between these warring versions of Christianity, or proponents of salvation, rather, that armistice came to be known as secularism. Would that be fair to say?
I think we can say this, yeah.
Okay, but secularism then went about to become the reigning absence of ideology, which at this point in history has weakened the West, because there's nobody was perpetuating conviction of belief, and so eventually belief just became absent. And within that absence, that's where we find ourselves now. There was this armistice and this peace, or this vacuum of belief, which can't last forever. So where do we go now? What are your thoughts on secularism? And it's cool that we kind of made overtures about your desire to investigate and participate in religion. So there's a sense inside of you, it sounds like there's a hunger inside of you that's not being compelled from the outside, but rather stirred from the inside, that is aware at some level that secularism isn't enough for you. And is it enough for you? Is it enough for society? What's the problem with it?
Right. So again, I think we agree way more than you may think. So if we look at the modern idea of secularism, or our contemporary idea of secularism, there is a massive distortion of terms and of terminology. Let me just give you an example. I'll give you two, which are very basic, I think. Number one, the notion of skepticism, and number two, the notion of reason. Skepticism, the OG skeptic, the original skeptic, was the person who is suspending judgment. That's how academic skepticism in ancient Greek arose. It's all about the suspension of judgment. But ever since, I don't know how far back to go, but it seems like right now, skeptic means being absolutely adamant and certain that all bad things about human nature are the case. And I have actually fought this in academia because I was 6 years in academia. I've had my PhD. I'm writing a book about how the notion of reason has been distorted. This kind of naturalism that has taken hold of the Anglosphere is just a disaster. Why? Because and that's essentially where modern skepticism comes into it. It's just modern skeptics do not suspend judgment. They don't say, I don't know. They're not at all humble. They're absolutely certain that there was an elevated image of the human being. That elevated image of the human being was communicated in the West by two traditions, ancient Greek philosophy and Christianity. Skeptics right now are absolutely certain, or they communicate a certainty, that all of this is just nonsense and wrong. Would you say that? Would you disagree with this?
I don't disagree. I just want to clarify. You brought in the word naturalism.
Yes.
I guess is that the positive aspect of what you're describing?
No, I think it's the negative. I want to show exactly how I think, culturally speaking, there are intellectual movements that lead people into a sabotage. So, for instance, I think the overwhelming majority of people have a moral conscience. That may be a weird statement, but I think that's true. But if they go to universities and they are taught essentially that morality is a lie or that morality is a fiction, they are being sabotaged by their institutions with respect to their moral formation. So the natural process of moral formation has been disrupted in several ways, one of which is by communicating essentially that morality is a fiction. So modern skepticism isn't, I'd say, a kind of secularism, an OG secularism. It's more an issue of being absolutely certain that morality is a lie, that there is no such thing as God, that there's no such thing as free will, the topic of my PhD, that there is no such thing as values. And I think that essentially what we are seeing is we do see a weakness in current Western states, and the question arises how to address it. Now, one of the weaknesses I see isn't a weakness that sways towards secularism, but actually towards the other side. And I'm not speaking towards the Christian side. I'm speaking of Western governments that seem to be very partial towards other religions. And they seem to celebrate other religions, but not, for instance, celebrate Christianity. We have, for instance, politicians who constantly go out and say what they should say for other religions, such as Islam, when they have celebrations. But when Christians are celebrating, and when we say Merry Christmas, they say, no, let's say Happy Holidays. To my mind, this is not the state being impartial towards totalizing views, but the state being slowly and steadily partial towards a totalizing view.
But the people in power are doing that. Why are they doing that? And why is that a particularly Christian pathology, or people who have been historically Christian are committing seppuku in this manner?
Right. So I'll give you a twofold answer, and I really want to hear what you think about it, especially from a Christian perspective. I think there are two reasons. One has to do with power politics, which splits into why the left does it and did it, and why some people who are very much in favor of, extreme economic libertarians are in favor of it, but also mainly it's multinational corporations. It's cheap labor at most. And then there is the side of belief, which has to do with Christianity and what I take to be It's focused on reconciliatory virtues. Now, let me just say some things briefly about the realpolitik of the issue, which I think is an important aspect. I think the left started losing the narrative after the fall of the Berlin Wall. They really had nothing to say. They lost the argument. They lost the argument. That's why, by losing the argument, they turned from a very arrogant intellectualism, the French intellectual of the 60s and 70s type, who says, well, it may work in reality, but doesn't work in theory. That's the kind of arrogant intellectual who never thought they could lose a debate. They switched from that into overly emotional temperament. So they started losing the working class. They started basically becoming pariahs. So initially, they were for open borders because they wanted to change the electoral mix. Problem is, they've allowed it to such an extent, and also the other side has allowed it to such an extent that this is going to go boomerang against the left. Why? Because you do see lots of parties, for instance, in England, we're going to have some Muslim parties that arise. These parties are going to vote for them, so the left essentially committed seppuku, as you said brilliantly before. So I think that's the reason why the left did it, mostly. Well, obviously there's the ideological side who says, well, just suicidal sympathy, what Gad Saad is talking about. And then there is the cheap labor aspect, which I think is the strongest. Because let me just say, here in the UK, we speak about labor, but it's the Tories who governed from the 2010 to 2024. And the reason why they did it was for cheap labor. That's the two reasons. Now, as far as Christianity is concerned, I really want to hear what you think about it, because I really don't want to misrepresent the tradition, and I'm really in the process of reading a lot about it, and I want to continue doing this. From my mind, it seems to me that Christianity focuses a lot on reconciliatory behaviors. So, in virtue ethical terms, we have the very combative traits. Achilles goes and slays everyone, for pride and honor and stuff. And we have the very reconciliatory virtues. And obviously we have the pendulum and a kind of mix of both. The Homeric ideal is really a mix of both. Lots of people like to say it's just crazy pro-war stuff, just go and slay everyone. That's not exactly it. But there's a pendulum of behaviors. The one is on the one side, it's the extreme, combative behavior, combative ethos that manifests in battle and the warrior ideal, but also in athletic contests and do you even lift, bro, and stuff. But also there's the more reconciliatory approach to the other side. It seems to me that Christianity has a list of virtues that is very much geared towards the reconciliatory bit. And there is a sense of let's be a bit more tolerant of what happens in the city of man, because in the way St. Augustine said, the city of God is what is most important. So let us render to Caesar what is unto Caesar, and let us just focus entirely on this side. And I think Luther was trying to recapture a sort of Augustinianism, and Luther had no doctrine of rebellion. But then I think the Protestants changed it. And they started changing
the doctrine of rebellion.
Yes.
That's juicy. What do you mean by that?
I think that and again, take that with a pinch of salt, and please fact check me, and also I'd appreciate if the audience fact checked me on this. It seems to me that in the beginning, Luther was very much focused on theological aspects as opposed to political ones. And he really wanted to stay away and not be associated with the Peasants' Revolt in, I think, in the 1520s. And essentially he said, you should follow your conscience, but if your conscience clashes with orders of a monarch, you shouldn't comply, but you also shouldn't rebel against the monarch. But it seems to me that, I don't know if it changes a bit with Calvinism or a bit later, that Protestants started adopting later on doctrines of when you are allowed to depose a monarch. I think I'm right. My chief source for this is Quentin Skinner's Foundations of Modern Political Philosophy, and also some books I've read about the Protestant Reformation. But please fact check me on this, and I really want the audience to tell me. What do you think of this?
Well, the next place I want to go is how the Greeks have, through their culture, at once developed the Homeric epics and then the pursuit of logos through philosophy. And then when Christianity introduced itself, they concentrated on, it seems like the Greek character has a character to it. I'm trying, sorry, pardon me for kind of fishing or reaching out. Because of the, and I'm just going to speak from the cuff, because of the couching of your culture in story, and even when it went into a very abstract realm, it was still communicated through story. It was communicated through dialogue. The philosophical tradition of Plato and Aristotle is probably a little bit more abstract, and I know that a lot of documents were lost, so maybe Aristotle had some dialogues and Plato had some just pure theory. But the way that the philosophy of Socrates and Plato is communicated, it's through a relationship. So you're talking about a human being, and so in the human being we can talk about these abstract ideals, we can extract or concentrate heroism and empathy, and then see how they combine and act out in a human life. And maybe that's the crux that a lot of our theories right now are really weakest at. We have these ideologues or these ideologies that don't capture or contain room for that full richness of what it is to be a human that only a story or poetic tradition can really communicate. So in the story of Christianity, there's a lot of personality in there. It's founded upon the life of Jesus Christ, the life that he embodied, and he has a lot of things that he speaks about, and they come across as riddles and parables. He says, there's this image of him as being completely subservient, or not subservient, but sacrifices himself to the state. He's anti-resistance. He just goes along with his fate. But then there's also this tradition of him, coming to bring a sword and splitting families apart. So there's this warrior spirit that's communicated, and there's also a warrior and ascetic spirit communicated through Greek culture, through orthodoxy right now. I think that's why a lot of young people right now in America are really turned on and drawn to orthodoxy. It's the beauty of the tradition, and it's the really nice, high-sounding words, but there's also, it's communicating to them as people, as the image, you put it beautifully, the image of the great man, or the greatness of a man, that is really lacking in all of these ideologies and stuff. And it's also lacking in, I'm going to tie it together, give it back to you. But these politicians that are selling out Christians, who are their primary supporters, or the primary people that they are there to represent and to protect and to serve, selling them out to Muslims, all of them lack a heroic character. They're buffoons. Trump is like, for all of his buffoonery and lowliness of character, especially last summer when he got shot, he really galvanized the possibility of a heroic character on the Western stage. And a lot of what's happening, to the detriment of the UK and the West, comes to cowardice of our politicians, the lack of leadership, and I think that does tie into a fear of strength. A lot of what we call the left out here, it's distributed leftism. It's no longer Stalinist. There's no great man. There's no single authority. There's just a bunch of weak people who are calling out to the weakness, or calling out to the laying down of any sort of strength in order to lift up the undertrodden. So that was, again, I just brought up a whole bunch. So
no,
I didn't answer what you were asking about.
I don't find anything you said something I disagree with. I don't think I mentioned anything about a great man. But
okay, you said I forgot. You said something about the images of a, and I didn't write it down. The image of a greatness in the elevated human. You said
yes. That's
what you meant.
Yes.
Okay.
No, absolutely the case. Yes, we do have weak politicians for the most part. I think that this isn't particularly a historical exception. To be very honest with you, I think most politicians throughout history have been sort of weak. And it's absolutely the case that lots of parties tend to have lots of pragmatists inside. And we do see in Europe a kind of problem. We have parties that are nominally center-right, but they are filled with pragmatists who constantly try to say we just we're gonna take the right for granted, and we're gonna go towards the center and the center left. And they engage in a dialectic in which they try to out-left the left. And we have all crazy people coming out and being essentially like this. But I would say that there's nothing I have against strength. There's nothing I have against, in a sense, politicians who are going to exercise authority and power. My whole question is, to what purpose and how? I think the fundamental human problem is where to draw the line, essentially, on anything. Because this is also in thought, but also in action. We think in terms of concepts. We can get things right in the abstract, generally speaking, but there is also the question of how do we exercise judgment about the concrete circumstances we're situated in, how we translate the general into the specific, because we are beings who live in both worlds. In Aristotelian terms, there are both universals and particulars. That's at least my perspective. So I don't have anything against power per se. I think that a lot of classical liberals are portrayed as being against power, but I think that this is fundamentally a mischaracterization, because in one respect, almost everything can be reduced to power. The question is whether we are going to use power for good or bad purposes. I think that speaking of stories and myths, you're absolutely correct. We can't just have philosophy. We can't just have ideology, because philosophy, let's start with philosophy, comes very late into civilization. In some cases, it didn't arise at all. And you could say it's a unique anomaly that started in the West. And I do stand by that claim. Lots of people are telling me, well, there's classical Indian, there's classical Chinese philosophy. Yes, there was, but not in the same way that there is a tremendous amount of discourse and argumentation as you see in Plato and Socrates, for instance, and the sophists. It's a wholly different thing. Now, philosophy abstracts from myth. Myth is very much portrayed on creating an image that we can relate to. And in that respect, it's very humanistic. Philosophy doesn't destroy myth, it builds upon it. I can give you all sorts of examples about it. We're going to have a course at Lotus Eaters that is going to be uploaded in several months, where I'm talking about ancient Greek virtue ethics, where I'm talking all about the tradition of virtue ethics and philosophy and how it arose from myth, and how it's absolutely mistaken when it's portrayed as being entirely anti-myth. This is an unfortunate Enlightenment myth, or lie, I should say. Now, when it comes to this, there are all sorts of epics, if we look down to human history, that do say on the one hand that power is really important, but on the other hand, there is also an element of justice. And this is something I really don't see on a lot of right-wingers who talk about antiquity. They talk about reclaiming the spirit of antiquity, but somehow they're against the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, which was, in a sense, the attempt to recapture the spirit of antiquity in a modern context. If we see, for instance, the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Theogony of Hesiod, there's a very clear myth that power is important, but it's not the only thing. I'll just give you a very small, very brief example. the theogony is a myth about the creation of the world from chaos. It has lots of references to the Babylonian epic, the Enuma Elish. But in the beginning, we have chaos. We have the first order of gods that arise, which is the order of Uranus and Gaia. And they give birth to the Titans. And then Gaia comes along and says, your father is the first who committed shameful acts. Take this adamant sickle and chop his genitals. Kronos comes in. He comes along. He represents raw, brute power. He overthrows the shameful order of Uranus, but he isn't much better than his father. When Zeus wins Kronos, he swallows Metis. Metis is wisdom. So the main message is, in order to create a just order, you need to combine power with wisdom. And it's not at all a coincidence that after Zeus swallows Metis, we have Evnomia arising, which is good laws and justice. So I think that if we look at history, we will see, on the one hand, people focusing very much on power, but on the other hand, focusing a lot on the issue of justice. And I think that this is something that a lot of people right now who are obsessed with power miss. So it's not that I'm against power. And it's not that I'm pro-weakness. I'm very much against weakness. I'm pro-power used in particular ways for good purposes. And to just end this, I think that one of the major problems with contemporary so-called conservatives, in the European context, it has a sort of a different notion. European conservatives, for instance, have the huge problem of having turned their backs to substantive values like the family, and are just weak proceduralists. And I think we should have procedural values, but we should also have substantive values. So I do want strength that promotes substantive values.
Just as philosophy was late to the scene, so is wisdom. Just to give a little interpretation of the tale that you shared, and I love myth. I love it.
Me too.
It took several different iterations of power before wisdom was introduced. So there's always going to be a line from the coarse to the fine, and then the fine starts to deteriorate because it's too fine, and then the reemergence of coarse power, course correction power. So if earlier you said that propaganda is that which justifies its actions. So if we are to engage in some propaganda, what would you be the propagandist for? Like what virtue or what power would you justify for what? You bring up ends justify these means. So what are the ends? What is the correct goal?
Right. So I'll give you a politician's answer. I think essentially, but it is gonna be meaty. Don't worry. Sorry, we can. Yeah. So number one, I don't think that we should call propaganda something that is not done in bad faith, and that isn't intentionally deceiving. So I would call it persuasion. Now that said, and now here is where the substantive part begins. I think that we need to recapture the idea that family is the basic social unit. So throughout the Western world, we have a tremendous problem right now with the institution of the family. We have all sorts of threats towards it. Some of them are cultural, others not, but essentially most of them are cultural. So I would say that focusing on the importance of the family is one thing. Focusing on the importance of culture and the nation is also other things that people on the right should promote, and should promote unapologetically. I really don't see why people are squeamish or they are very apologetic about promoting these values, because we had years and years of a left that tried to distort reality and try to brainwash everyone into thinking that if you are in favor of any traditional institution, you're just a sheepish bigot. I think all this must go. And to a very large extent, this starts from, this is part of the left, the attempt to be transgressive and destroy customs, but especially one of the prime inspirations for how this manifests is this attack on reason that we see in postmodernism, which splits history in two and says that reason, tradition, family, nation, all these are, in a sense, phallogocentric, and you don't want this, you need the exact opposite. So I would say that I am in favor very much of these values. I'm also in favor of liberty as a classical liberal, and I'm very much in favor of raising up awareness that liberty is fragile and that people need to resist one of the bad tendencies people have throughout history, and also in classical liberalism and in classical liberal societies, but basically in every society, the 100% retreat into the private sphere, which on the one hand, I think there should be a private sphere and it should be championed. But on the other hand, I regret to see people who are, in a sense, not concerned citizens. And they constantly try and say, well, I have some liberties, I'm okay, I'll be okay. And they do the meme, how does it affect you? While Rome is burning, how does it affect you? And I regret to say that I know several of these people. And I have been very unpleasant to them. And yes, and some friendships have ended, but that's life. So I'd say that generally speaking, I am in favor of values I consider to be salient with respect to promoting, number one, society and a healthy social order and traditional virtue. And these institutions, in a way, I want them to create an ordered framework within which people are going to have a significant degree of liberties. And let me just say one thing. I think one of the reasons why being pro-liberalism and, in a sense, all of its corollaries is because it gives you some very good signs of when people try to distort it, disrespect people, disrespect and disrupt society, and become tyrants. Because one thing that totally gets lost into discussions of this is that society our nature is to a very large extent customary. Even extreme rationalists like Spinoza and Leibniz knew that. Leibniz, who is one of the foremost rationalists, says we are 3/4 habitual beings. This habitual aspect has been, in a sense, hardwired into us by endless years of cultural of environmental influences that had nothing to do with conscious thinking. So the very attempt to completely revolutionize society by destroying every institution and by opting for really fast and rapid change is disrupting society and destroying it. So these are some of the values I'd be in favor of.
That brings up, you mentioned reason, and when we were talking about secularism, you brought up two things, reason and skepticism.
Yep.
And we went down the path of skepticism. I don't know if we got to the core of it, but we didn't get into reason. So what is reason? What is its purpose? And if it does, going out on a limb here, if it does have to do with the conscious aspect of a man evaluating and then choosing atop or within the context of custom and culture, where does it arise? How has it been shaped? I mean, my moniker is the voice of reason, but I'm I don't even know what that means. So if you could help me out, what is its purpose? What is its cause?
Great. Thank you very much for asking me this question, because in fact I'm writing a book on it, and it's a very big project so far. Right. So here is where actually the strength comes in. Because if you look at the notion of reason that the so-called secularist skeptics advocate, and no wonder you're going to think that people who are, in a sense, pro-reason are weak. Right. So reason starts, in a sense, with the concept of the logos. The concept of the logos in ancient Greece had all sorts of meanings. It meant an account, it meant someone's speech, it meant someone's reason, someone's justification for something. When they were trying to say why something was good, they gave facts that supported what they were suggesting, or they thought they were supporting what they're suggesting. And it also meant an intellectual power, like our ability to think and figure things. But perhaps one of the first people to use this term in a metaphysical sense, denoting a cosmic principle that governs all the unfolding of events in the universe, was Heraclitus. If you know, Heraclitus is in some ways the opposite of Parmenides. The popular view is that Heraclitus says everything is in flux, and Parmenides was the opposite, the forerunner of the nothing ever happened school. Says change is an illusion. That goes back to Parmenides for people who want to see the metaphysical strand of the nothing ever happened school. So Heraclitus was essentially saying that the logos is the governing principle of the world. And by our minds, we can cognize the logos. And because we can cognize the logos, which is in a sense the higher being, the logos in us as an intellectual power is the higher element within us. Ancient philosophy and all non-materialistic philosophy has a hierarchy of parts of the soul which functions in a way as a moral compass. It doesn't tell you everything you need to know about morality, but it functions as a moral compass. So the notion of reason does a very robust job in ancient Greece. It essentially allows you to know things, both in terms of the fundamental principles of the universe, the first principles, God, or what people associated with the term God, but also it gives you moral intuition, it reveals you stuff. A lot of people say that there's a complete distinction between deontology and virtue ethics. That's wrong. Stoics, for instance, say that virtues are dispositions conformable to reason. So reason does show you things. It is your moral conscience as far as morality is concerned, and the virtues of character are dispositions that are conformable to it. And that's essentially part of the ancient Greek tradition. And
briefly, just to interject, within reason, the ought and the is harmonized and combined.
Absolutely.
There's no...
Yeah.
It's perceived by the reason.
Yeah, the is what is moral as far as moral intuition is concerned. Yes, okay. Absolutely. Now, this sort of changed a bit with late Neoplatonism and Christianity, because late Neoplatonism had a departure from, who was it? Plotinus and Porphyry, who were the Western Neoplatonists, and they were a bit more optimistic about where reason can get you. They thought that reason can allow you to cognize the intellect, which essentially is like the mind of God, and then from there to ascend and to merge into the one. And then the Eastern Neoplatonists that started predominantly with Iamblichus, the Syrian Neoplatonist, they started being in favor of theurgy. And they said that, in a sense, salvation, or the highest good for life, isn't achieved by your reason or by your own attempts or by your own actions. The henads, the gods, need to somehow reveal themselves to you. That's why there are the initiatic practices and all the bits. So there is a sort of devaluing of a small devaluation of reason in that respect. This bit, despite the differences between Neoplatonism of the Eastern variety and Christianity, Christianity sort of, on the one hand, personifies the Logos as Jesus Christ, but it seems to me that it sort of draws a wedge between what reason can reveal to you and what faith grants you. But still, I think that they did accord a high status of reason within their texts. Both St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas did this. In a sense, you can say they were rationalists. And afterwards, I think, essentially, that was the concept of reason ever since, ever since Heraclitus. It changed basically with Hume. Because Hume comes along and says, no, human beings are not 3/4 habitual beings. Human beings are 100% habitual beings. All human behavior needs to be understood in terms of customs and in terms of habits, like Pavlovian dogs who are entirely malleable, shaped by our environment. Now, what Hume does is the following. Contrary to what the skeptics of nowadays say, Hume gives zero argument for this. He essentially starts his treatise on human nature by saying there are two kinds of contents of the mind. There are impressions and relations of ideas. And the way he defines them, it's just like saying reason is a complex sensory mechanism, which means he starts by giving a different framework and saying, well, reason before essentially led to irreconcilable disagreement, but I do want the possibility of universal agreement. So in order to save the promise of the project of achieving universal agreement, I'm going to cut down everything that leads to disagreement. So I need to get everyone on board. And that's essentially how he was bringing down reason from being the noble aspect of our nature, at least in ancient Greece, but also really strong intellectual power within the Christian tradition, down to the level of essentially the slave of the passions, as he puts it. When he says that reason is the slave of the passions, he essentially says reason cannot reveal moral truth to you. Reason can only show you ways of satisfying your desires. And as he also puts it, it is not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the world to the scratching of my little finger. So, for all his virtues in other places, I really like his politics, I must say. I think that this has been a disaster, which has been adopted ever since by people who claim to be skeptics, a la Hume. Hume was much more sophisticated from them, and they claim to be skeptics. And I honestly have spoken to people who, within academia, let's say, who are very prominent within academia, and they have made a name out of how skeptic and naturalistic they are. They simply don't understand the is-ought distinction by Hume and how it undercuts morality by creating a materialistic framework, which essentially says there is no such thing as a hierarchy of value within the human soul. All hierarchies are hierarchies of complexity, of material complexity. We have atoms in motion. It depends on the level you're looking at. And that's it, really. So within Hume, you have an exile of reason from morality. And that's really when it goes FUBA, in a sense.
And Hume is where that is-ought distinction is parlayed from.
I think he's correct about it, because
so it's funny that
I think he's correct about it. If you start by saying that I only have descriptive things and any kind of normative property seems to be a bit weird, it doesn't fit into it, you get error theory of the 70s that said, for instance, well, normative properties are required for morality, like rightness, wrongness, moral goodness, moral badness, moral virtue, moral vice, fairness in a moral context, but it doesn't feature into this. So morality is all a mistake. And we also had within the Anglosphere the emotivists, the expressivists, who essentially said, well, just morality it's a lie. It's not veridical. It's just an expression of an emotion. And really what happens, we need to see why this happened. It happened because on the one hand, we need to give the devil his due, in a sense. There was the problem within rationalism of saying, well, rational intuition is infallible. I know the truth, and I'm going to enforce it on you 100%, and I have zero doubt. And I must admit, I do think that a lot of ideologues, especially the pre-woke left, had a rationalistic template on their thinking. That's why they had 5-year plans. They completely underestimated the habitual nature of human beings. But that shouldn't allow us to say, well, they did it, so it's only Hume from now on. That has been a disaster for the West, culturally speaking. So I think that this is essentially the issue, that when we have people who think that they are infallible with respect to morality, there is a dark side into it. There's the dark side of sometimes going full tyrannical about it. And it has happened in history. And it did happen in the Soviet Union, for instance. It's not that there is exactly a good CV as far as that idea is concerned. But something that is concerning, on the other hand, that needs to be addressed is that, precisely as you said, this sort of attitude, which I think should be traced to Hume's influence, does lead into weakness, and we do become sort of weak people if we think along this way. And in a sense, there needs to be a sort of Jungian shadow into the mix. And essentially, I see it like fire. Too close to fire, we can burn, but too far away from it, we can freeze to death. So yes, I do think that people who are of a Humean persuasion, and often they have interesting politics, have some things to say about the dangers of dogmatism, but I don't think we can entirely do without dogmatism 100%. That's why when you spoke of neutrality, I try to frame it not as 100% moral neutrality or 0% moral neutrality, but there needs to be a sort of good balance between, there needs to be a balance of, no, we're not going to trans kids, for instance. No, that's not going to happen. Mm-hmm. Right? I'm not going to... Yeah. I'm just giving some examples. I don't know if that's too spicy for YouTube or something. So, sorry.
No, not for my channel. I specialize in complaints about the mutilation of children.
Great. Okay.
So Jonathan Haidt is bandied around a lot about his master and the elephant, or the rider and the elephant, which is kind of a Humean idea that a great extent of our reason is deployed at rationalizing our passions. I think that is a psychological reality of being human. That doesn't, to over-rely on that metaphor, to say that everything, there is no rider, there's only an elephant that has a chat GPT on top of it, like explaining why it's happening, is false. But the way for me to square that is that there is, you brought it up earlier, there's a moral development that happens. A human being unlocks free will, kind of like a video game power. It's a power that you get after you accomplish certain things, and after you're able to organize or understand and then overstand the complexities of your life. You grow more aware of yourself. You grow more conscious. You grow also more responsible. That's why it's why we protect children from predators. But it's also why we don't expect too much for children, but we expect a lot of adults, because they should be responsible. They should have grasped the ability to be responsible for their decisions. And there isn't just this elephant. We don't just let everybody let their elephant out of the room. That's what the left eventually wants. It's just like it's all elephants all the way down. There's nothing above it, and so we should wrangle the elephants in such a way that we can harmonize them somehow, so everybody can be fully elephant without trampling each other. So we'll just trample everything until we get it right. So it seems like that the the change from reason to rationality, or reason to rationalization, or the obfuscation of the difference between those two, is part of what you're describing. And if we get back to an earlier understanding of what reason is, I think we can get to an understanding of what free will is. We can get to an understanding of what responsibility is. And I'm going to throw in something and see where you go with it. But I don't think you can really communicate these ideas, communicate reason as a faculty, without saying a faculty of what? Like a faculty of what? It's the soul. You have to have some sort of higher state or aspect to the self that's superior to the material, superior to the passions, superior even to the intellect, in order for the intellect to be serving something other than itself or the passions. Does that track? And how do we propagandize or persuade us of the existence of the soul, so we can understand reason as something higher than just rationalization?
Great. So first of all, rationality and rationalization are different things, as you implied in the beginning. And I think that Jonathan Haidt, Michael Shermer,
Pinker,
also the other author of Enlightenment Now, Steven Pinker, they have lots of good things to say empirically speaking. I think philosophically they're massively wrong. So I tend to read them as Humeans. They have good stuff to tell me as far as my habitual nature is concerned.
Human psychology, yeah.
And our habitual knowledge is concerned. But I always bear in mind what Leibniz said, and perhaps, I don't know whether it's 3/4 or it doesn't matter. We do have that aspect of a higher function of the soul, or higher part of the soul. Now, I don't think that in order for us to argue for this, for a reason, we need to first argue for a soul. We could do the other way around, in a sense. Which, and in that respect, we go deductively from kinds of stuff we all take for granted and a good theory must account for. We infer the existence of a soul that is a bit more complex than the material wants to imply it is. So I think essentially what we all doing boils down to the following. We are confronted with several data now, and we try to make sense of it. That's the human intellectual capacity. Now, if we start by defining that data as sensory, as the Humeans are doing, we have completely lost reason from the mix. That's why, in a sense, propagandism and all these linguistic tricks are present not just in politics, they're also present in philosophy, and the importance of framing. So we have data, and we want those data to be accounted for by particular theories which functions as worldviews. What is interesting is that the current secularist has a substantive degree of commonality with ideologues. Ideologues are those who are constantly siding with their theory over data that clashes with it. Constantly, repeatedly. So their theory seems to be more like an inversion of reality. It's more like we have lots of stuff, lots of human experiences, let's say, or we have lots of lived experiences, let's call it whatever, our truths. I'm joking. And we want them to be explained. But the ideologue and the secularist, in the pejorative sense we have been talking about, comes along and explains them away. And we come now with lots of people like Yuval Noah Harari, who comes and says, well, all human beings are what they think is false. We have false ideas. There is no self. The self is a delusion. But on the other hand, if there's no self, who is having that delusion? Just a question, Mr. Harari. Yeah, and what we need to do, I think, is to say, no, we are going to resist ideology, and we are going to see lots of features of things that we shouldn't part with, and theories must account for. And I think there is something that Hume knows brilliantly, and philosophers ever since antiquity know brilliantly. It's that there is the problem of induction. You can't establish general truths. universal statements by just citing a finite amount of empirical observations. If you're a materialist, you're wedded into a sensationalist view of the mind. Sensations give you only access to particulars, not universals. And that's when you face the problem of induction. So if there is any kind of general statement that is true, then we need to part with sensationalism, because we say its truth cannot be established by a finite amount of sensory observation. So we just don't, it's just as simple as that. In the same way that Hume parts very easily from the tradition up to that point, we can just say, well, no, he lost a lot of things. And he took philosophy to a very bad direction. And we lost a lot of things out of it. So we could say, for instance, things like, well, let's give examples of things that we think we know and say, well, how do we account for them? And if we have generalized statements, then empiricism cannot account for them, or at least Humean one. And that leads us into either traditional rationalism or Kantianism. Kantianism says, I think it's also disastrous, by the way, because it constantly puts an as-if clause into how we experience the world. All general statements in Kantianism are concepts of the mind. They are the mental imposition upon the raw sense data of experience. It's what the mind projects. But there's always the gap. We don't know whether that which the mind projects upon the data of experience actually reflects reality. So there's a constant as if in Kant. We need to see the world as if we can know it, as if it's extended in time and space, as if causal relations exist, as if we have free will, as if we're moral agents. I think
and that is disastrous. That attitude is disastrous because it can't help but erode one's communion with anything, even their relationships. I act as though I love my wife. I don't actually love. I act as though I love my children. I don't actually love. I act as though I enjoy this or that thing, but it's really just dopamine receptors and a simulation. So everything's a simulation, and there's always that film. Even if you're doing intellectually and in order to do some novel experiments with thought, it'll eventually ingrain itself into your experience so that you are as if you are, and that leaves a huge gap in what human beings desire, need, and are. You know, if you go down Buber, like I and thou, or a more religious understanding, where the goal is to become naked, is to back away from the clothing of difference, to actually merge with experience, to actually have communion with yourself, with other people, and with the higher power. That as-ifness. Sorry, I'm just bringing your ideas into my mind so I can understand them better.
Absolutely, and I will check Buber. I haven't read I and Thou. And if you recommend it, I'll definitely check it out. And thank you for...
Oh, it's very poetic. It's very short, too.
Thank you for pointing it to my attention. And let me just briefly add to what you said. All this, love is just a chemical imbalance in the brain. I just have no time for it. I have time for Plato's Symposium, where, love is a sort of yearning for eternity. And a meeting of souls with the yearning for eternity. And there's a really good video that everyone can check briefly on YouTube by Michael Sagru, who is talking about Plato's Symposium. And he gives a very brilliant example. He says, why do young people carve their initials and say, for instance, Jack and Amanda in love forever? How do you explain forever? Yeah. So it's a sort of... there is so much destruction and explaining away of the human experience within materialistic, naturalistic, physicalist secularism in the modern sense. It's just a disaster spiritually.
Yeah, it's embedded in how you talk about it, what the moral judgment, the non-value neutral description that you're giving, explaining away. So in order, it's not real understanding. It's knowing in a way, but it's a cheap kind of knowing because it's always propositional, overly propositional at that. So you brought up Kant, you brought up all the bad guys, so then you kind of pointed to traditional
Rationalism.
reason or rationalism. So what's the proper or the correct or the better?
Right. So I think all of these things are really dangerous. So they have dark manifestations. Kantianism, humanism, and rationalism. Rationalism has this propensity to tyranny in ways that some other views have different problems. But at the end of the day, I think we can't live without strong moral convictions. We could try to harness them. We could try to exercise the virtue of self-control, temperance, and also try to constantly bear in mind the dangers of our power, in a sense. But that doesn't mean that we should completely throw it away. Let me just give you an example. You don't go for unilateral denuclearization. It's just mad. Right? I think it makes sense.
Because if one person says no, then you're SOL. Yeah.
You went FUBA again. Or you are about to. Right. So I think essentially we need a sort of traditional rationalism, knowing full well that there are several problems and bad propensities towards it. Because we're human beings, we are fallible, and we're imperfect creatures. And there is a tendency to some rationalists to believe that they are sort of, unique. They are God's gift to human nature. They're infallible. They know it. Everyone else doesn't. And as you know, I've had the misfortune of talking to several communists at my university. They're absolutely certain that they know everything. They know what needs to be done. They're absolutely certain. There's 0 degree of fallibilism there or something. So it seems to me that at the end of the day, we need to draw the red line between excessive and appropriate fallibilism, as well as excessive and appropriate rationalism and dogmatism. I tend to view wisdom, I'm trying to give a different definition of wisdom as an intellectual power. It's knowing when each basic intellectual attitude is appropriate. So know when to be dogmatic, know when to be dogmatic in a negative sense, know when to affirm, know when to deny, and know when to suspend judgment. I think at the end of the day, if we go for balance and we try to develop a very sophisticated philosophy which incorporates metaphysics, epistemology, politics, ethics, all of the above, essentially that's where we are going. Other way, we have the hubris, that a lot of anti-enlightenment thinkers call the Promethean temperament, that man thinks he can be God. There is such a propensity in rationalism. So I think that we should temper that propensity. But on the other hand, we should draw red lines to people who are trying to be completely subversive. So at the end of the day, I think that's where we should be aiming at. And that's where I try to aim at. And because I know that I'm fallible and I know that I don't have access to everything, I think it's essentially good to be part of a community of people who think that way. Because I have access to several stuff you don't, you have access to several stuff I don't. And our audiences, all of them, each and every individual in the audience, they know things we don't, we know things they don't. That's why I think it's important to opt for a kind of community that sort of keeps us sane. That's why I think also it is important to cherish and somehow champion the value of free speech and the value of the free marketplace of ideas, knowing that it can also backfire and that there are many dangers with it. But I think fundamentally it is a way of somehow keeping us sane and reminding us that we are not God, which I think we need to.
Mm-hmm. But what is rationalism?
Great. Okay, so I think rationalism has several there are several kinds of rationalism. Now, one thing that you may see with our discussions, and I hope there are more, and with stuff I'm saying, and I'm very annoying to several people, is I think in Aristotelian terms, I think in terms of kinds. I think that's the intellectually responsible way of thinking. There's no just golden one thing. And I really agree with Aristotle when he was saying that Plato talks about goodness abstractly. I'm going to focus on human goodness. And there are goodness for other beings. And he was talking about kinds of goodness. So I'm going to talk about kinds of rationalism. There's the metaphysical rationalism, which I think is mostly bonkers. Or to a very large extent, it's a bit bonkers. Some of them take it really to Hinduistic ways that, you just completely deny relations and all change. That's the Parmenidean school, and there are some elements of British idealism that converge into it, and there are also some academics who work in it now. It's nice as a thought experiment, but it's a bit off the rails, as far as I'm concerned. Now there is epistemological rationalism, which says essentially that reason is supreme intellectual power, that in matters of knowledge, to the degree that we can know things, reason is what we should be. Reason is a power and also arbiter of our best sign of what is truth. And as far as psychology is concerned, we could say that the psychology within rationalism is sort of tied to this elevated view of the human being that anti-rationalists frequently deny, especially the empiricists, because they want to undercut this tradition. So I would say that that's essentially a sort of psychology that goes by placing reason as being a significant and noble part of the soul, which will function as a moral compass. And then there's moral rationalism, which is tied to epistemic rationalism, which says that moral reality, just like reality, reveals itself to us by means of reason, and reason can cognize moral truths and moral properties in the same way that it can cognize other properties and universals. So I think that's a good way of accounting for rationalism in a good way, in a provisional way.
So what is reason, though? Is it the voice in my head? Is it the ability for me to figure something out and to have a sense that there's a tension here, and then to work through the contradictions until something crystallizes? Is it that process? Is it that aspect of what I carry around with me?
Right. So I think that you have hit upon a problem within the tradition, that you can't easily tell phenomenologically from a first-person standpoint whether something you think reason reveals to you is actually revealed to you by reason, or whether it's bias reinforcing itself, and whether it's confirmation bias. So rationalists have a predicament here. They can either try to give a good phenomenological account of this, or part with rationalism. I think they go for the first. They go for the first option, which is a very difficult point, and what essentially almost all of them who are sophisticated have done is that they essentially say that reason is an intellectual power which is non-sensory. It cannot be reduced to the senses, and it reveals several properties to you. It grasps universals that the senses cannot grasp. But in order for you to get to the point where you say, I know this, and I have a fully fleshed, worked out perspective, you need to engage upon decades of training. Essentially, in Plato, it's the education of the philosophy king. It's not like the empiricist detractors of rationalism say, well, we took 100 undergraduates into a room. We gave them 20 questionnaires, and they all said they gave us conflicting reports about intuition, about their moral intuitions. So moral intuition is wrong. That's not at all. That's essentially to not take the tradition seriously. That is essentially to not have read Descartes, to not have understood the meditations and the very tiring process that he undergoes in order to say, well, I may be deluding myself in thinking that my reason reveals to me that something is the case. Let me see to what extent I can doubt it. That's, for instance, the Cartesian version of rationalism. It's not fail-safe. That's why I also think it's important to stress fallibilism. But also, there's a more atomic view in morality especially that says, well, there are some moral truths, like, for instance, it's morally wrong to torture human beings, and it's morally wrong to do horrible things to babies. I think it's a bit difficult to go against, let's say, and perhaps the best way of accounting for it is by saying that this is what morality reveals to us. That said, the rationalists of old were very much aware that we are not gods. We do have a divine aspect of our nature as far as ancient rationalists are concerned, but we can't be gods. We can't rise to the level of gods. And that's why Socrates was saying essentially, no one is wise. If I'm wiser than you, it's because I know my own ignorance, which means I don't take myself to be a god. That's why I love wisdom. And because I love what I cannot possess or don't possess. And because love has the element of eternity, he says I can't be a god. And if I ever achieve wisdom, I may lose it. And I'm going to live my life as an examined life in the pursuit of wisdom. So ancient rationalism, it has elements of fallibilism within it. That later ideologues come, they completely abstract their tradition from these aspects, and they say, well, yeah, we come up with 5-year plans. Or communist 5-year plans.
Could you, as an aside, I sometimes I use this app called Twitter or X to do this thing called shit posting, where I just kind of like, I don't know if it's taking the piss or giving the piss. That's a British term, so I never understand what's being given and what's being taken in that formulation. But I kind of poked at the Scottish common sense people. They were saying I got into a little bit of a discourse, and people got upset with me because I was kind of making fun of that on a wordplay level. But what is common sense? Is that something that aligns with what we're talking about with reason?
Right. So
or is that another tradition?
So yes and no. Short answer. Let me elaborate just a bit. I think that, first of all, shitposting is something I have done, and I'm not going to pretend I haven't. Occasionally, it's very funny. Occasionally, it's just very funny. Sometimes I can't resist. Right, so I got it out of my system. Okay. So, common sense realism is a very interesting tradition. It's essentially part of the tradition of the Scottish Enlightenment. Now, I really think that the Scottish Enlightenment tradition has lots of good things going for it, especially when it comes to society and anthropology. But that said, I think that common sense departs from my rationalism. I'm very sympathetic to common sense, and in fact, I think that in some cases they're not open to problems that rationalism is open to. But maybe.
Wait, so just we have to define common sense. Is that like the collective understanding? If you put a bunch of people in the room, they'll have a general idea of the right direction, just because of distributed knowing or something like that.
I think you went straight to the heart of the matter.
I cut you off the pass.
Because one of the perennial questions in epistemology is, how do you define common sense? Because a lot of people in the common sense tradition, they want to talk about common sense as being a set of beliefs that sort of organically or spontaneously arise in human beings, which I sort of see. I do think that there is an element of this, but I also think that there is a bias sometimes to not understanding the importance of theoretical philosophy. Let me just give you an example. A lot of people in the 20th century, we had this sharp divide between metaphysics and ordinary language in Anglo-analytic philosophy. And there was, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was a very ingenious thinker, who I mostly disagree with. But he was a genius. And he was constantly saying, well, I want to destroy metaphysics. I want philosophers to go out of business. I want to focus on the rough ground of reality and ordinary language. A lot of ordinary language is actually metaphysical language. Ordinary language, for instance, we'd say involves the notion of potentiality. I think the notion of potentiality comes from Aristotle. So I don't think, number one, it's easy to say where the line between common sense and theory and the speculative disposition is, and why there should be a very sharp line. On the other hand, I think that they do have a point, and they are correct in saying that, wait a minute, the ideologue asks us to part with so many things we are thinking about. Well, perhaps the ideology is wrong, and the burden of proof is on them. It's not on us. It's not on my shoulders to convince Harari that I exist. It's on Harari's shoulders to convince me that I don't exist. So they do have some things going on. But I do think that essentially in some cases they miss the fact that a lot of what we take to be common sense is in fact coming from lots of people who were exceptional and weren't the exact average person. And also there's the other bit that what is common sense is very much influenced by a lot of factors that are social within which people live.
Sorry, I just had to close my window.
Yeah, so a lot of the times what most of people think is common sense is very much influenced by social factors they're maybe unaware of, or they're unaware of the way that these factors shape their thinking.
So I visited your studio. Swindon or Swinton?
Swindon, right? Yeah. Unfortunately, I wasn't here that day.
Yeah, everybody was either sick or partying or something or on vacation. But there was no common sense in Swindon. There were parts of it that were trashed beyond belief and parts of it that weren't. Like, what's the common sense there? There were different cultures and different modes of being. There was no common sense. Actually, there was a lack of common sense. Nobody wanted to take authority over all of these different behaviors or sets of behaviors and say, no, we do this way here. It was a free-for-all. So common sense just became, I think of that kind of joke about the pride flag where somebody paints all the colors of the rainbow and mixes it all up and it just turns to shit. Like there's no order that was being imposed upon that chaos because weak leadership, so on and so forth. So common sense, where's common sense when Rome is burning? Where's common sense? Who are we appealing to? Right. So it seems to be kind of when I criticize aspects of liberalism as taking for granted that people have good faith, that power can be distributed through rational means. It's like, no, that arose in a certain context where people, through the grind of history, assumed a certain mode of being such that became common sense. Christianity became common sense to people. And now that we don't have Christianity, we have secularism. And that's leading to the inability to have a common sense anymore because there's an active resistance to any sort of what you were calling the tyrannical aspect of rationality, that which imposes order, hopefully with wisdom. But we can't see the wisdom for the fear of tyranny. And we also have this deep Christian understanding that anything that's real and authentic comes from the inside out. It comes as a confession of faith, or reason is something that I perceive. I can be taught how to reason, and I can be developed through different exercises and stuff, but I'm the one who lifts the boulder of what is real, what is ought, and what is not. And then I bear the consequences for those choices. So common sense can't stand on its own, but maybe I'm straw manning the Scottish people just because I'm playing around with the word common sense.
I mean, let me just give you a very small, funny side. You're absolutely correct about Swindon. I posted today about a bike that was locked on a place and everything has been stolen from it.
Yeah.
I said, just never forget to
Except
lock your
for the
bike
lock.
in Swindon. Yes, exactly. And the skeleton. But all the wheels or the stuff, they're missing. Carl, whenever we have guests, Carl wants to show them the dark side of Swindon. I'm doing the exact opposite, and I've joked live that I had a shit posting segment. I'm saying I'm giving them the Pyongyang tour. I'm taking them to the one really good neighborhood of Swindon, and it's just different ways. I'm giving them the Pyongyang tour of Swindon. We have the right. I don't think that Swindon is particularly a commonsensical place, but I would like to understand a bit more how this ties into Swindon's demise, because it seems to me that what has happened to Swindon, and I'm not an expert, everyone else here is way more qualified to tell you about the downfall of Swindon. Lots of people pinpoint it around 2007 and 8, some of that. But for instance, I'll tell you, we have lots of hotels that have illegal migrants there who cross the channel and they're placed there. And yes, sometimes they steal, sometimes they have a negative effect in the neighborhood. A lot of stores are closing. It seems to be the case that Swindon is one of the places that has been targeted for, let's say, not termination exactly, but it has been targeted, and say that this is one of the places where we are going to put lots of illegal migrants there. I would say that this is governmental overreach, because it's fundamentally based upon a policy that is unpopular. No one has voted for mass migration. No one has voted for this. And essentially this is a state that says, I'm going to be authoritarian. I'm not going to care about what people say. I'm going to enforce this upon them, whether they like it or not. So in that respect, I wouldn't exactly hold it against to the Scottish realism people.
Yeah,
but,
for sure.
Yeah.
It would be one thing if this authoritarian government was actually making the country of the United Kingdom better, but it's making it actively worse. Maybe it's making it better for some people, the people who are coming in and the people who are watching red line go up, or whichever color line we want to watch go up. But it's, so I guess just to kind of pivot a little bit, I understand the desire for right-wingers or certain people on the right to not pussyfoot around authority or tyranny and say, you know what, fine, it's necessary, let's just have it go in the right direction. That's what the most important thing now is, not whether or not we deserve a tyrant or we can afford or we don't want one. It's necessary to course correct, and we need to set it in the right direction. To what degree is that offensive to you, impossible, or undesirable rather? And what would be the answer, the correct corrective to this authoritarian overreach of your government, and to extent my government, especially if it goes back to the hands of the Democrats?
Right. So I think that, number one, I think that it's important to understand people's anger. It's very important to understand why lots of people are angry about what they feel is the disintegration of their country, and what they feel is a sort of missed and lost future for them. Because a lot of many Zoomers, for instance, right now are saying, well, there are essentially no good prospects for me in the same way that there were for the previous generations. And the more we go back, the better prospects they had, starting with the boomers. Or at least that's the Zoomer myth. So I would say it's very important to understand, first of all, what has went wrong, and understand that a lot of people are very angry about it. I also think that on behalf of, it's important for people who want to make an intellectual contribution to also say that sometimes anger may be justified, but it's not always a good counsel. So anger, like an emotion, has its place. And speaking from a traditional perspective, almost every list of virtues has temperance in it. It's about tempering emotions and triumphing over them. So I do think it's very important to understand people's anger and understand our anger, because I'm angry as well. And try to offset the negative effects of anger in discernment. Because it's as Aristotle says, it's very easy to get things wrong. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of ways to get things wrong. That's why we need discernment. And discernment needs to be, in a sense, rational and temperate, and rest upon a character that is self-controlled. So, number one, I hesitate to go down the populist way, without being against the idea of popular government. I hesitate to go down the populist way of saying people are angry, therefore I'm going to be in favor of everything the people want me to say will satisfy their anger. Number one. So discernment is key. That's why I think, if we bear in mind, people are always angry. I'm not devaluing or diminishing the importance of it, but I'm trying to bring perspective into it. Politics is sort of designed to make people unhappy. It's designed upon the clash of powers and sides, and each side wants its people, in a sense, to be unhappy and be angry. Because in some cases it's justified. I'm making lots of people angry with my segments because I'm talking about stuff that make people angry. Just constantly saying, well, everything is just a utopia is really actually going to cause way more chaos. So politics has always been, to a very large extent, about anger, because as Machiavelli says, anger and hope are two of the fundamental human motives. So, to a very large extent, people are angry. But to some extent, people may think that lots of situations are worse than they actually are. And I think it takes a really strong character that we should be opting for to say, well, let's try to discern what is going on, and let's try to see what is happening and what should be done about it. Now, you mentioned the word tyrant and when tyranny is appropriate. Now, I'll give you a diplomatic answer, but without dismissing your concerns, because I do want to address the point, but I want to say that I wouldn't use the term tyranny, because I think tyranny has almost invariably, since time immemorial, at least since Aristotle, I think, and Plato, has been used as a pejorative. And there is the question of, again, that Machiavelli says in Discourse on Livy, after Rome became an empire, essentially a tyranny, the way he says it in the context, there were many hits against tyrants, none against tyranny. This is the part of the wise part about Machiavelli that some people don't mention, who like to mention the other bits of him that are really essential for understanding politics, and especially modern politics. So I do think that, in a way, we need to be very careful about the language we're using and the framework, the way we frame things. And when we are about to say that someone like, a really strong man with massive authority needs to come up forward. That said, I will say something that is a bit controversial. if you read Locke, second treatise, chapter 18, called On the Prerogative, you'll see a lot of things there that you wouldn't expect if you have the basic idea of Locke as being essentially a, carefree, just let me grow and everything's going to be fine. So Locke is very much adamant about the idea that sometimes there needs to be a strong authority that solves an issue. And I think that this is where the fundamental issue lies, in that liberalism has a very rich political tradition. Part of it has been classical Republican in nature. This doesn't mean that every classical Republican has been a classical liberal, but a lot of classical liberals were classical Republicans. And there has been this Roman inheritance of the notion of the dictator, because basically that's where it all goes. Let's be honest. That's where it goes. The notion of the dictator, and when you need someone to come along and have supreme executive authority to solve an issue, right? I think also there is. I remember Victor Davis Hanson, who was talking about the order of the Cincinnati that was attached to the founding fathers. So this idea wasn't at all foreign to the idea of the U.S. founding fathers. But I still think there is a world of difference between calling. There are two basic elements that I think people are not addressing here. Number one, when do we face a situation of emergency? Which comes the question of, which situations call for the declaration of a situation of emergency. And then the basic question is, what's going to happen afterwards? Are you calling for a Cincinnatus or a Julius Caesar? So, for instance, let me just give you Machiavelli, who is the darling of the realists. And to a large extent, I count myself as a realist, because I think it's indispensable for explaining politics. He speaks very highly of Cincinnatus. And he says that Cincinnatus, he was this farmer. He was called by the childish republic to come down and solve the issue. And when he solved the issue...
he retired to a farm, right?
Yeah. He gave the power back. And then we have the other view that is, no, I'm going to use constitutional crisis in order to turn my society into a tyranny in perpetuity. So I think that this is essentially one of the most revealing issues into the conversation of the question of whether right may go too far in these contexts that a lot of people aren't having. And in a sense, I'm trying to be a bridge builder here, because I think you're also a bridge builder, and I think we have had a tremendous discussion so far, and I really appreciate the fact that we are having it. And I think it's 100% on good faith. I think that this is an issue that isn't particularly addressed. And one of the things that worries me is, number one, a lot of people are very much prone to a sort of, you could say, self-victimization narrative, which makes them very much non-level-headed with respect to declaring a situation of emergency. And that's a narcissistic type, which, for instance, would be anti-rational. It's the exact opposite. That would be the voice of anti-reason, let's say. Which would culminate in an over-sentimental behavioral mentality, which would be very prone to declaring someone an existential enemy on the simplest of pretext, and therefore calling for a situation of emergency to emerge and the constitutional order to be violated. So that's one thing. We can go about it, and that's, I think, where the conversation, a lot of the discourse of the so-called woke right comes into it. Really, if you focus on the discourse. And then there is the other bit, that when people are calling for a dictator, assuming they have got it correctly or incorrectly, whatever, it doesn't matter. Are you calling for a Cincinnatus or are you calling for a Caesar? And what I see, which absolutely finds me against, is a lot of people who may pay lip service to Cincinnatus or may be very explicit to the idea that, hey, I want a tyrant, who are completely discrediting all sorts of institutions and essentially a culture, because that's what a lot of classical liberals miss, and a lot of liberals miss, the importance of culture, that they're missing the culture that would demand from the tyrant or from the dictator to give the power back after this situation has been solved. Because if you read, for instance, Hayek is very much adamant in saying that, well, yes, a republican order of the type he is proposing combines what he claims to be the goods of monarchy, republicanism, democracy, and democracy. And it says that, for instance, the military, there are some situations, like situations of military, when you're being invaded, where you just don't have time to turn your country into a huge assembly. You need to act fast.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not at all accurate to say that classical liberals, sophisticated ones, have absolutely zero provision for these situations of emergency. And the question is, why, if you are calling for a Caesar, maybe you are calling for a tyranny, and some people want to defend it. I wouldn't want to live under a tyranny, whatever. They may think that they're going to get to be the tyrant. But at the end of the day, I'm not talking to them. At the end of the day, I think that there are lots of people who may pay lip service to Cincinnatus, but attack day after day after day the very culture that would demand from a dictator to give the power back. Because it's one thing to say, well, yeah, occasionally the constitutional order has problems and there are huge crises that we can't solve unless we appeal to someone like a Cincinnatus. That's one thing. But just saying that that we need someone to come and be that these institutions have zero good thing for them and they should be completely destroyed, and we are going to move to a more, within quotation mark, chadish view, is, I think, erroneous. And let me just briefly say this. I see lots of people who of that persuasion who constantly protest, well, it's not eternally Europe 1930s, and yet they do have a point. It's not constantly Europe 1930s, but a lot of these people think that, who protest against people who say it's perennially Europe in the 1930s, they seem to be thinking that it's perennially Rome 49 BC. And I think that that's not even remotely appropriate, not even from an absolutist standpoint. I'll just give you an example. Jean Bodin, one of the fathers of French absolutism in the 16th century, he was saying, sir, enough with discourse about Rome. We're French. We have a tradition that goes back to centuries. Let us read French history. Why? Because we are talking about another culture.
Yeah.
And let me just say this. A lot of people are constantly talking about, they protest on the one hand against abstraction, against the abstract liberal order and whatever, which, mostly it's a mischaracterization. But they abstract a lot of things when they're talking about, for instance, the Weimar Republic. And they say, well, yeah, we had people like Schmidt talking about the Weimar Republic. So suddenly this is all 100% accurate for the American Republic or other republics around the world, which I don't think it's accurate. But even then, I'd say that there's a lot of abstraction. And even then, in the reading of Schmidt, on the one hand, for instance, yes, on the one hand, he's correct. Politics does boil down to rivalries. On the other hand, you could say that that's not what politics is only, what it's supposed to be. But on the other hand, the question is, how do you define an enemy? How prone you are to define an enemy? What is to be done about your enemy? There are all sorts of questions that a lot of people who think about it don't ask. There can be good answers, there can be bad answers. But I'm trying to say that a lot of the criticisms are very one-sided. And they're very abstract. That's why one of my key points, which I'm saying against people of all sides, including to people who use the term woke right, because that's what we said we are going to talk about, is that we shouldn't abstract historical context from the mix. So
Stelios, I know it's late for you. I didn't mean to interrupt.
sorry.
No, I know it's late for you and your crew. This has been an absolutely gangbusters conversation. And it's absolutely, we're going to have another one when your book is ready. Do you have like an understanding of timeline on that project?
I hope we have a conversation sooner, because that's going to take years.
Okay. You're not just going to pop it out.
No, because I'm doing essentially a whole research of the main thinkers, and I need to cover from Heraclitus to today, and
Okay.
I've covered the ancient Greek stuff and the early modern stuff, but I have the medieval ages to cover, and also lots of the 20th century. So that's going to take a while.
Wow. You're a completionist, I hear.
Yep, I am. Yeah.
So then what's something that's coming up? You said you're going to have a discourses around mythology and
Right.
stuff.
So we are going to have a course here at Lotus Eaters about ancient Greek virtue ethics. It's going to have 9 lectures. A lot of them are really informative. One of them is about 3 hours, where I'm talking about essentially the development of ancient Greek virtue ethics from the pre-philosophical tradition up until Plotinus. So that's going to be something that is going to be released in the coming months.
If you had a patron virtue, which would it be?
I don't think I can answer.
Is there one that you work on the most, I guess? Your favorite
Yeah,
one,
okay,
or the one that you dislike the most because you have to struggle to
Right, okay. So
perform
I think it's wisdom.
it.
Wisdom, yeah.
Meaning, you already said, but just
Well,
to bring it back
That's
up.
one of the things I want to understand, what it means. And essentially you go out, again, you invariably hit upon an Aristotelian wall that people use it to cover different means. So when it comes to wisdom, there are several ways of going about it. We have, first of all, there's the metaphysics of wisdom, that what is wisdom in the human being. And some people are trying to say it's a disposition, others try to say it's a mental state characterized by knowledge of something. Others going to say it's not mental states, the knowledge of something. And then each of the different schools are essentially giving flesh and blood and content into that idea. So if you define wisdom as knowledge of first principles and knowledge of important human truths, the question is, right, what kind of human truths are important for you? And different thinkers give you different accounts for it. And then there's the Renaissance ideal, that is the more humanistic ideal, that sort of treats wisdom less as a kind of knowledge and more as a kind of disposition. And I think that it starts with Pierre Caron and Michel Montaigne, who have an idea of wisdom that really culminates into the bad things we talked about Hume before. I think they completely take out the element of moral knowledge from wisdom. And they essentially, say that, the wise person is the person who knows how to be rational, and rationality is just a way of navigating across ideas. But it has been essentially dethroned from the elevated position it had in the previous traditions. And then there are also other...
I really enjoy... Yeah. No, I'm sorry.
And then there are also other traditions that have a view of wisdom. There is wisdom in Buddhism, wisdom in Indian philosophy. That's that.
And what wisdom is the one that you're aiming for? Like, you're aware of all these different versions, but is there syncretic wisdom? Or,
right. You could say this a bit. I'm sort of an Aristotelian Platonist on this. It really depends on the day. I mostly agree with Aristotle, but occasionally I agree a lot with Plato on some issues. I don't see them so much in clash, because a lot of the stuff that Aristotle takes are from Plato. But
in dialogue.
Yeah. But I think he has a tremendous debt to him. But I'd say that I side there. And I'm also very, very friendly towards Thomists.
The guys that know everything.
I don't know if they know everything, but I really like...
The acquaintances, Thomists, Thomas Aquinas?
Yeah.
Is that the right Thomas? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, because they have a very heavy focus on Aristotle as well. And I may say this, which in some occasions it may not seem as, the best of thing in intellectual circles, but I do admire the scholastic approach, that is relentlessly focused on, let's just point out exactly what we mean, all of the things we mean, and just pinpoint them.
I'm trying to put a finger on why I enjoy speaking with you so much, but it does have to do with the way you're approaching matters. I don't think it's so much a disposition as in a state, but a way in which you're engaging, which in another context I would call playful. But playful sounds a little too light, but it seems like you're actively pursuing something. You're actively engaging with the material rather than coming at it in another way where you have knowledge and then you tie knowledge together with theory. It's like you're in the mix. You're making the pasta.
Yep.
Sounds like.
Absolutely, yes.
It's really
I
enjoyable.
think it's honest.
Yeah.
I mean, there are lots of people with, canned answers or who have already figured out everything. But
yeah.
I'm not one of them.
I'm not one of those either. Yeah. Stelios, I'm going to wrap up the conversation now. Thank you so much. I'm going to link to your work down there in the description. People can find you at lotuscedars.com, and if they want to engage in your postery, they'll find a link to your Twitter down there too.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this. I really enjoyed it.
My pleasure.